They say every war starts with something small, a single spark, a single word, or in this case, a single antenna. By the time it was over, half the neighborhood had turned against itself. The HOA president had vanished from public life, and one quiet, rule-abiding homeowner had become a suburban legend whispered about on every cul-de-sac in Clearwater Oaks. No one saw it coming, least of all him. It began on a calm evening, the kind that makes you forget how fragile peace can be. The street lamps buzzed softly, sprinklers ticked in the distance, and from the open windows came the faint hum of televisions, sitcom laughter, muffled news anchors, the heartbeat of a perfect, ordinary community. But behind one set of blinds, something was stirring. A light glowed from a small upstairs room, rows of radios, dials, wires, and blinking LEDs flickering like a cockpit in the dark. Inside sat Daniel Brooks, a man who had no idea his life was about to be dissected, judged, and rewritten by a handful of neighbors with clipboards. That night, he wasn't thinking about bylaws or violations or aesthetic harmony. He was chasing a voice, a faint signal bouncing between continents, static silence, then connection. The kind of moment that makes a man feel small and infinite all at once. But that feeling didn't last long, because somewhere across the street a curtain moved. A pair of eyes watched the silver antenna stretching toward the stars. A photo was snapped, and within 48 hours, a letter would arrive that would turn one man's passion into a full-scale rebellion. At first glance, Clearwater Oaks looked like paradise. Manicured lawns, perfect mailboxes, the smell of freshly mulched conformity. But beneath the calm surface lived something uglier, control disguised as community, order enforced by fear. And when one man refused to bow to the beige gods of suburbia, the system turned on him with every petty rule it had. This isn't just a story about a hobby. It's about what happens when ordinary people fight back, not with violence, but with words, laughter, and a microphone. Because sometimes the quietest man on the block can broadcast the loudest revolution. So tell me, how far would you go before you let your neighbors decide what freedom sounds like? Clearwater Oaks wasn't the kind of neighborhood you stumbled into by accident. It was the kind of place you planned for. The perfect suburban dream printed in glossy brochures and sold with words like community, harmony, and exclusive. Rows of beige and cream homes lined the streets in immaculate order, each one separated by just enough space to feel private, but close enough to remind you that someone was always watching. Every lawn looked freshly trimmed, every mailbox identical. Even the trees seemed to grow at matching angles, as if nature itself had signed an agreement with the HOA. On paper, Clearwater Oaks was paradise. Families waved to each other on morning jogs, retirees tended to their rose bushes, and children rode bikes in quiet cul-de-sacs without fear. The sidewalks gleamed, the ponds reflected postcard sunsets, and every porch light flicked on in perfect unison as evening fell. But underneath the perfection, beneath the smell of fertilizer and fresh paint, there was a quiet tension, the kind that only comes from too much order, too many rules, and too many people convinced they knew what was best for everyone else. Daniel Brooks had lived there for 7 years. Mid-40s, an IT specialist who worked from home, Daniel wasn't the loud type. He kept his grass mowed, paid his dues, waved when waved to. He wasn't looking for trouble. If anything, he'd moved to Clearwater Oaks to escape it, the chaos of city life, the unpredictability of renters and noise and neighbors who didn't care about property lines. He liked rules, at least in theory. They gave structure, predictability, a sense that things would stay in place. What he didn't know then was that in Clearwater Oaks, rules weren't about order. They were about power. Daniel's house sat near the end of Magnolia Court, a quiet bend where the streetlights cast long shadows across driveways. His was a modest 2-story with blue shutters and a front porch swing. Emily, his wife, insisted on painting herself. It creaked when you sat on it, a little imperfection in a place that didn't tolerate many. Inside, the home was warm, lived in, filled with traces of Daniel's dual nature. Neat stacks of manuals and circuit boards on one shelf, a mess of half-finished gadgets on another. His pride and joy was the spare bedroom turned Radio Shack, a world of knobs, frequencies, and quiet humming equipment that connected him to people he'd never meet. Ham radio wasn't just a hobby. It was his escape. When Daniel sat in that chair, headset on, listening to the whisper of voices bouncing off the ionosphere, he wasn't a suburban homeowner under the watchful eye of an HOA. He was a traveler, an explorer, a man reaching beyond fences and bylaws. Emily teased him about it. "You and your invisible friends," she'd say, smiling as she passed with a cup of coffee. She didn't understand the thrill of hearing a faint signal from halfway around the world, but she understood what it meant to him. It kept him steady, gave him something that was his. The HOA didn't notice him for years. Why would they? Daniel wasn't one of the loud ones, not like Mark and Lisa from down the street, who once got into a shouting match over whose trash bins were left out too long. Not like the couple on Oakview who tried to paint their front door red and were promptly fined for aesthetic deviation. Daniel kept to himself. But in Clearwater Oaks, invisibility had a time limit. The HOA was a tight operation, run by a board that treated the neighborhood like their personal kingdom. At the top was Margaret Hollis, a woman whose authority was as sharp as her haircut. Early 50s, always in pressed khakis and pastel polos, she had a way of smiling that didn't quite reach her eyes. Margaret was the kind of person who believed that good fences made good neighbors, and that she should decide what those fences looked like. She'd been president of the HOA for 6 consecutive years, re-elected each time without opposition, mostly because no one dared to run against her. Her golf cart was her chariot, her clipboard her sword. She patrolled the streets like a suburban sentinel, making sure no blade of grass grew too wild. No shade of beige strayed too bold. Her right hand was Walter Dempsey, the treasurer, a retired accountant who spoke exclusively in numbers and rules. Walter was the enforcer of dues, the collector of fines, and the keeper of the sacred spreadsheet that documented every violation in the neighborhood since 2009. He wasn't cruel, just relentless. The kind of man who believed that if the books balanced, so did the universe. Then there was Sharon Lee, the secretary, who had an encyclopedic memory for gossip disguised as community updates. She was the one who always seemed to know who was late on dues, who had an unapproved swing set, or who dared to use the wrong mulch. Together, the three of them formed a trifecta of suburban authority, unchallenged, unwavering, and increasingly bored. That boredom, perhaps, was what made them dangerous. A board with nothing real to manage always finds something to fix. Daniel had seen Margaret before, of course. Everyone had. She made herself visible, a constant presence at the park, at the clubhouse, during her early morning patrols. He'd even nodded to her once while unloading groceries. She'd given a polite, approving smile, and the kind that said, "So far, you're acceptable." He thought nothing of it then. But Emily noticed. "She watches everything," she'd whispered one day, pulling the curtains closed when Margaret's golf cart hummed past. "I swear she's measuring the trees." The first real warning came quietly. A small beige envelope tucked under their doormat. Friendly reminder, it read. Their garden hose had been left coiled in a visible position. A minor thing, easily forgotten. Daniel shrugged it off, coiling the hose neatly the next day. But the wording lingered in his mind. Visible position. It sounded ridiculous, but in Clearwater Oaks, everything was measured, monitored, reported. Over time, Daniel started to notice things he hadn't before. The way Margaret slowed her golf cart outside certain houses, scribbling notes on her clipboard. The way Sharon lingered at community gatherings, listening rather than speaking. The way neighbors lowered their voices when the board passed by. The HOA didn't just enforce the rules, it controlled the rhythm of life in Clearwater Oaks. Every Thursday night was Yard of the Week selection. Margaret would tour the streets, evaluating lawns like a pageant judge, deciding which property best embodied aesthetic harmony. Winners got a small sign in their yard, a badge of approval that was both reward and warning. Those who never won learned not to ask why. Daniel's house never got the sign. Not once in 7 years. Emily used to joke about it. Maybe our grass is too green, but there was always an undertone to her laughter. They both knew the HOA's praise wasn't random. It was currency. It kept people compliant. Still, life went on. The HOA was a background hum, an annoyance everyone tolerated. Until one weekend changed everything. It started innocently enough. Daniel had been saving for months to buy a new antenna, a sleek 25-foot vertical mast that could pick up international frequencies. It wasn't flashy or dangerous. It was just tall. He planned it carefully, even checked the local codes. He didn't think to ask the HOA because, well, why would he? It was his property. He spent an entire Saturday digging, pouring concrete, assembling the structure piece by piece. When it was done, it gleamed in the afternoon sun, rising through the branches of the old oak tree like a silver spine. That evening, he sat in his radio room tuning the dials, waiting for that faint hum of connection, when a voice from the Falkland Islands came through, clear and real. He couldn't help but smile. For that moment, everything felt perfect again. But perfection doesn't last long in Clearwater Oaks. The next morning, Margaret's golf cart slowed in front of his house. She stared upward, visor tilted against the sun, lips pursed. Sharon snapped a photo from the passenger seat. They didn't stop, didn't speak, just made a note and moved on. Emily saw it through the kitchen window and froze. "They're looking at the antenna," she said quietly. By Monday, the envelope arrived, beige, sealed with the HOA crest. "Notice of violation," it read. Article 5, Section 4B, Unauthorized Structure. 14 days to remove it or face daily fines. Daniel read the letter twice. The words felt absurd, cold and heavy, as if written by a machine pretending to understand reason. Unauthorized structure. It wasn't a gazebo, it wasn't a shed. It was a pole, and not just any pole, one the FCC explicitly allowed under federal law. He tried to brush it off, telling Emily it was probably a misunderstanding, but deep down, something had shifted. That night he sat in his shack, staring at the glowing dials. The excitement he'd felt days earlier was gone, replaced by an uneasy hum, not from the radio, but from the air around him. Clearwater Oaks had noticed him now. He wasn't invisible anymore. Over the next few days, the tension simmered. Margaret waved to him when she passed, her smile too wide, too knowing. Neighbors who used to chat over fences seemed quieter, more cautious. Daniel caught Walter pacing near his driveway one afternoon, phone in hand, muttering about non-compliance. Even the mailbox, once just a mundane part of daily life, started to feel like a messenger of doom. At night, Daniel would walk the block, pretending to stretch his legs, but really just observing. He began to see the cracks in Clearwater Oaks' perfect facade, the way people lived in quiet fear of reprimand. A forgotten tricycle on a lawn, a slightly faded wreath, a trash bin out a few minutes too long, all potential sins. And always, the threat of another beige envelope. Emily tried to keep him calm. "It's just rules," she'd said softly. "You'll talk to them, it'll work out." But even she could sense that this wasn't about the antenna. It was about control. The HOA needed him to bend, to admit fault, to prove that their power was absolute. In the following days, Daniel found himself at odds with his own instincts. Part of him wanted to comply, to take it down and move on. But another part, the part that lit up when that voice from halfway across the world came through his speaker, refused. He wasn't breaking the law. He was simply existing beyond the HOA's comfort zone. He didn't know it yet, but that small act of defiance would ignite something much bigger. The HOA would strike back harder than anyone could have imagined, and Daniel, quiet, reasonable Daniel, would become the unlikely symbol of resistance in a war fought with fines, bylaws, and the weaponization of pettiness. And as the lights dimmed across Clearwater Oaks that night, the air hung heavy with the kind of silence that always comes before a storm. The beige envelopes became a part of Daniel's daily life, as routine as morning coffee or the low hum of his radio equipment. At first, they came once every few weeks, then once a week, then almost every other day. Each one carried a new accusation, a new line from the HOA's endless catalog of rules: improper lawn edging, unauthorized exterior structure, non-compliant mailbox paint. It started to feel like a game, a cruel, methodical game where the HOA held all the cards. The antenna violation still hung over him, unresolved. Daniel had written a formal appeal, polite, factual, filled with references to federal regulations protecting amateur radio operators. He even included diagrams citing the exact subsection of FCC law that overrode local restrictions. He'd expected foolishly that logic would prevail, that once they saw he wasn't breaking any real law, the matter would be dropped. Instead, the board responded with silence. Then, 2 weeks later, another envelope. Failure to comply. The fines had begun, $50 per day, accumulating until the unauthorized structure was removed. Attached was a photo of his house, the antenna circled in red like a criminal's mugshot. When he called the HOA office, he got Sharon. Her voice was syrupy, practiced, the kind that could make even the word violation sound polite. "We understand your concern, Mr. Brooks," she said sweetly, "but the board's position is final. You are, of course, welcome to attend the next meeting to discuss it further." The next meeting. He knew what that meant: the small, fluorescent-lit room in the clubhouse, the long plastic tables, the rows of folding chairs filled with bored or fearful homeowners. He'd been to one years ago, when they'd voted on whether Christmas lights should be limited to white and warm tones. Margaret had run it like a judge presiding over court. He'd watched as one neighbor tried to argue for colored bulbs, and left humiliated after Margaret gently reminded him that tradition builds unity. Still, Daniel went. He had to. The meeting room was colder than he remembered. Margaret sat at the head of the table, papers neatly stacked before her. Walter and Sharon flanked her, each with matching clipboards. Around the room, a handful of residents murmured quietly, their faces a mix of curiosity and fear. When his turn came, Daniel stood. His voice was steady at first, calm, reasonable. He explained the federal protections for amateur radio operators. He talked about communication, emergency preparedness, even community benefit. But halfway through, Margaret raised a hand, silencing him. "Mr. Brooks," she said, her tone smooth but cutting, "we appreciate your passion. However, Clearwater Oaks is a private community governed by its own covenants. Those covenants exist to maintain harmony and property value. Your device disrupts that." "It's an antenna," Daniel said, "and it's legal." "Legal," Walter repeated, tapping his pen, "isn't always appropriate for this community. We have standards." Margaret smiled thinly. "We'll take your comments under advisement, but unless the board votes otherwise, the fines will continue." She turned to the audience. Next on the agenda, unapproved solar lights on Rosewood Lane. The meeting moved on without him. When Daniel returned home that night, Emily was waiting on the porch. She didn't have to ask how it went. The look on his face said enough. He sat beside her, staring into the dark. Somewhere down the street, the soft hum of a golf cart echoed, faint but unmistakable. Over the next few weeks, the HOA's pressure intensified. The fines grew. Letters began mentioning potential legal action. The language shifted from reminder to final warning. Each phrase was colder, more mechanical, as if written by an algorithm trained in intimidation. Then came the landscaping violations. It started with the hydrangeas. The Brooks bushes, planted years ago, had grown slightly beyond the approved height. Daniel trimmed them, but a week later another notice arrived. Improper shrub symmetry. He stared at the photo they'd attached. A close-up of the right bush leaning half an inch wider than the left. He laughed at first, then he didn't. Next came the mailbox. It had a faint chip in the paint, barely visible unless you were inches away. But apparently it didn't meet aesthetic standards. Another $75 fine. When he repainted it, They claimed the shade of black was inconsistent with approved color palette. It was madness. Neighbors began whispering. Some offered sympathy behind closed doors. Others avoided him entirely, afraid that association might draw Margaret's attention. Clearwater Oaks had an unspoken rule. You didn't challenge the HOA. The moment you did, you became a cautionary tale. But one neighbor didn't avoid him. She watched. Mrs. Everett, an elderly woman 2 houses down, had a reputation for being the community's eyes. She was always outside, pruning, sweeping, pretending to garden. But Daniel noticed how often she glanced his way. Sometimes he'd see her phone raised, snapping photos. Other times she'd just stand by her fence, shaking her head as if silently judging him. One afternoon, he caught her crouched by his property line, measuring something with a tape. "Can I help you?" he asked sharply. She straightened, startled but unapologetic. "Just checking the setback distance," she said. "Margaret asked me to verify." "Verify what?" "That your antenna isn't encroaching on common property." He stared at her, speechless. She smiled faintly, pocketed the tape, and walked away. Emily was furious when he told her. "They're sending neighbors to spy now," she said. "This isn't a community, it's surveillance." But there was little they could do. The HOA's power came from fear and apathy, and Clearwater Oaks had plenty of both. Then came the lawn incident. Daniel woke one morning to find a bright orange flag planted in his front yard, pending re-inspection. Attached was a notice claiming unapproved grass variety. Apparently his fescue blend didn't match the HOA's preferred species. They gave him 10 days to replace or reseed, or face escalating fines. Emily tried to calm him. "We'll fix it. We'll just do what they want." But Daniel was done. "No, this is harassment." That night, he took photos, documented everything, the letters, the timestamps, even Mrs. Everett's photos of him. He compiled a file and contacted a lawyer. It cost him $500 for a consultation, but it felt like progress. The lawyer listened, sympathetic but cautious. "HOAs can be powerful," he said. "You're on solid ground with the federal law, but they'll drag this out. Be ready for a long fight." And so it began, the quiet war. The HOA didn't back down. If anything, they escalated. Daniel's appeal for legal mediation was met with a counter-notice, a demand for access to inspect his backyard for possible code deviations. When he refused, citing privacy rights, they accused him of non-cooperation. That week, the community newsletter featured a thinly veiled editorial about certain residents failing to uphold neighborhood standards. It didn't name him, but everyone knew. He began receiving strange looks at the mailbox. Conversations would stop when he approached. One evening, someone left an anonymous note on his porch. "Just take it down. You're ruining it for everyone." The pressure bled into everything. Emily became anxious, double-checking every detail before leaving the house. Even small things, the position of the garbage bin, the color of her garden gloves, started to feel like potential infractions. Their once peaceful home now felt like a fortress under siege. And still, the antenna stood, silent, gleaming, defiant. Then came the night someone cut his coaxial cable. He discovered it at midnight, when his radio went dead, mid-transmission. He followed the line outside, flashlight in hand, and found the cable sliced cleanly near the base of the pole. Not chewed, not frayed, cut. He stood there, heart pounding, the beam of his light trembling in the dark. The next day, he reported it to the HOA. Margaret's response was chillingly casual. "That's unfortunate," she said. "But the antenna shouldn't have been there to begin with." He realized then, this wasn't just about rules. It was personal. The attacks grew bolder. Someone left a dead bird on his porch, a crow, its wings spread, a note beneath it that read, "Not welcome." Another time, his trash cans were mysteriously overturned in the night. Once he caught a shadow moving near the fence, but by the time he got outside, whoever it was had vanished. Emily wanted to leave. "We can't live like this, Dan," she said, voice trembling. They're never going to stop, but Daniel couldn't walk away. Not anymore. If we give up, he said quietly, they win. And they'll do it to someone else next. Word of his defiance spread quietly through the community. A few neighbors began to show subtle support. A nod, a whispered, "Good luck." A message slipped under his door. Some even started sharing their own stories. Fines for wind chimes. Letters about inadequate mulch coverage. One man fined $100 for parking his car facing the wrong direction in his own driveway. Clearwater Oaks, it turned out, was full of resentment, simmering just beneath the surface. The tension reached a breaking point when the HOA held an emergency meeting, this time specifically about him. The notice arrived 3 days prior, mandatory attendance for discussion of ongoing noncompliance issues. The clubhouse was packed. Margaret sat poised, flanked by her board. Daniel stood alone at the podium, his evidence folder clutched in hand. The audience whispered as Margaret began. "Mr. Brooks has repeatedly failed to comply with multiple community standards," she said smoothly. "Despite numerous opportunities, he has refused to cooperate." "That's not true," Daniel interrupted. "I've complied with everything except one, the antenna. And that's federally protected." Margaret's smile didn't falter. "Federal law doesn't override our covenants." "It does," Daniel shot back, opening his folder, pulling out printed FCC documents. "Here, read this. You can't ban antennas. It's illegal." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Walter shifted uneasily. Sharon scribbled something on her clipboard. Margaret's composure cracked for just a moment, a flicker of irritation, before she leaned forward. "This isn't about legality, Mr. Brooks. It's about community standards. And right now, you're dividing this one." He met her gaze. "Maybe it needs dividing." The room went silent. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, from the back, a voice called out, one of his neighbors. "He's right. They fine us for everything." Another joined in. "You can't even plant flowers without permission." The murmurs grew into a low rumble. Margaret slammed her gavel. "Order!" But the order was gone. That night marked a shift. The HOA had pushed too far. People began to question. The whispers that had once condemned Daniel now turned against the board. Anonymous flyers appeared in mailboxes. "Know your rights." "Don't let the HOA silence you," Margaret retaliated, of course. The next morning, Daniel received a notice of lien intent, the HOA's nuclear option. They were threatening to attach his property for unpaid fines. Emily cried when she read it. Daniel just sat, staring at the paper, a mix of rage and disbelief twisting in his chest. They were trying to take his home, the one thing he'd built his life around, over a metal pole in the yard. Something inside him broke that day, but not in the way Margaret expected. He stopped hiding. He started recording every conversation, every letter, every threat. He built a timeline, posted it anonymously on homeowner forums, and within days it spread. Other residents from other HOAs reached out with stories eerily similar to his. He wasn't just fighting Clearwater Oaks anymore. He was exposing a system, and then came the email that would change everything. A former HOA board member, someone who'd quietly resigned 2 years prior, sent him a message. Attached was a file labeled Internal Correspondence. Inside were dozens of emails between Margaret, Walter, and Sharon discussing strategic enforcement and selective compliance. One line stood out. "Make an example of Brooks. Others will fall in line." Daniel stared at it for a long time. His hands shook. He had proof. For the first time in months, the power shifted. He forwarded the files to his lawyer. He printed copies for himself. He even slipped one anonymously under a few neighbors' doors. The truth was out there now, and it was only a matter of time before it exploded. But as he looked out his window that night, the antenna glinting under the moonlight, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was far from over. Clearwater Oaks wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a machine built on control. And now that he'd broken its silence, it was going to come for him harder than ever. The question wasn't whether the HOA would strike back. It was how far they'd go to protect their power. And Daniel, exhausted, angry, but unbroken, was ready to find out. By the time the sun rose over Clearwater Oaks that Friday morning, Daniel Brooks knew the war had reached its breaking point. The air felt heavy, not with rain but with anticipation, like the world was holding its breath before something snapped. For months, the HOA had buried him under threats, liens, and intimidation. But today, for the first time, Daniel wasn't afraid. He was ready. He had the proof, undeniable, written proof of corruption, favoritism, and personal vendettas disguised as community enforcement. And by tonight, the entire neighborhood would see it too. It started 3 nights earlier, when he'd received the HOA's final letter, hand-delivered, sealed with a red stamp that read, "Final notice before foreclosure." The words made Emily's voice break when she read them aloud. "They're trying to take our house, Dan," she whispered. He took the letter, set it on the table, and stared at it for a long moment before saying, quietly but with finality, "No, they're not." He had already sent the leaked emails to his lawyer, to local news outlets, and to the county housing office. But the most important step, the one that would truly expose Margaret Stanton and her board, would happen at the next community meeting, the one she herself had called Friday evening, 7:40 p.m. The clubhouse buzzed with tension long before the meeting began. Neighbors whispered in tight circles, clutching their copies of the leaked emails, the ones that had been anonymously printed and stuffed into every mailbox 2 nights ago. Some were furious, others confused. Many were afraid. At the front of the room, Margaret sat rigid at the board's table, her hands folded neatly over a stack of papers. Her silver hair was perfect, her suit impeccable, but the faint tremor in her fingers betrayed her composure. To her right sat Walter, pale and sweating, and Sharon trying to avoid eye contact with anyone. When Daniel walked in, the murmurs shifted. People turned to watch him, whispering his name like a secret they'd just learned the truth about. Some nodded to him, small gestures of solidarity. Others simply stared. Margaret's smile was icy. "Mr. Brooks," she said, her voice steady but brittle. "You're late. I figured you'd want everyone to be here before we start," he replied calmly. She cleared her throat and picked up her gavel. "This emergency session has been called to address ongoing noncompliance and the recent misinformation circulating about this board. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that defamatory statements are subject to legal action." The words hung in the air, a thinly veiled threat. Daniel stepped forward. "Then I guess you should be careful what you say." A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "You do not have the floor, Mr. Brooks," he ignored her. He set a thick folder on the podium and faced the residents. "You've all seen the emails," he said. "You've read how they talked about us, about you. They fined people not because they cared about this community, but because they wanted control. They targeted families. They mocked people behind closed doors. And they tried to take my home. Illegally." Margaret slammed the gavel. "Out of order." But no one looked at her. Every eye was on Daniel. He opened the folder and pulled out a few printed pages, his voice gaining strength. "Here's an email from Margaret to the board. Brooks needs to be made an example before others get ideas." And another from Walter. "We'll let Everett keep her unapproved fencing since she's cooperative." A woman in the crowd, Mrs. Everett herself, stood up suddenly, face red. "What?" she shouted. "You said my fence was fine." The room erupted. Margaret banged the gavel again. "Order, order." But order was gone. Another neighbor, Mr. Hanley, waved his phone. "You overcharged me for repainting my garage. You said it was policy." Margaret's mask began to crack. "These claims are taken out of context." "Really?" Daniel interrupted, his voice rising for the first time. "Then explain this." He pulled out a printed image, one of the internal spreadsheets the whistleblower had sent him. A list of violations, each with handwritten notes next to certain names. "Watch him. Increase fine. Repeat visit. And next to mine, make him quit." The room went dead silent. Even the air conditioner seemed to stop. Margaret's hand trembled. "That document is confidential. It's evidence," Daniel said. "And it's already been sent to the county." "Oh, and the press," gasps again. Then murmurs. Then something deeper. Anger. Mrs. Walker, the elderly neighbor who'd always smiled kindly at Daniel, stood up with tears in her eyes. "You fined me for having a bird feeder, Margaret." "A bird feeder," Walter muttered. "We were following precedent." "No," Daniel cut in, his voice sharp. "You were following her." All at once, the room fractured into chaos. People shouted, demanded refunds, waved violation letters in the air. The carefully maintained illusion of order, the HOA's greatest weapon, had shattered. Margaret stood, slamming her hands on the table. "This meeting is adjourned," she snapped, but no one moved. Then, from the back, someone shouted, "Call the cops!" Margaret turned toward Daniel. "Yes," she hissed, "do that. He's trespassing on HOA property." Daniel laughed, short, humorless. "You really don't get it, do you?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small recording device. "I recorded every conversation we've had for the last 3 months." The blood drained from her face. "And guess what?" he continued. "You said, and I quote, 'We'll bury him in paperwork until he breaks.' That's extortion, Margaret. You don't get to hide behind HOA bylaws anymore." For the first time, she looked afraid. The sound of sirens cut through the night air outside. Heads turned toward the glass walls as red and blue lights flickered across the room. Margaret straightened, regaining a shred of her poise. "Finally," she said, "someone's here to restore order." But when the officers entered, they didn't walk toward Daniel. They walked straight to her. "Mrs. Stanton?" One of them said, "You're under investigation for financial misconduct and falsification of HOA records. We'll need you to come with us." The room froze. She blinked, stunned. "There must be a mistake," she stammered. I'm the president." "Not anymore," said a voice from the doorway. It was a county official, the same one Daniel had contacted with the evidence. The state auditor's office received credible reports of embezzlement and selective enforcement. "The board is being temporarily dissolved pending investigation," Sharon began to cry. Walter put his head in his hands. Margaret tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Her composure shattered completely as the officers took her by the arm. She turned one last time toward Daniel. "You think you've won?" she spat. "You've destroyed this community." He met her eyes, calm, steady. "No," he said. "You did?" As she was led outside, the neighbors poured out after them, phones raised, recording everything. The woman who had once ruled Clearwater Oaks with quiet tyranny now stood in the flashing red-blue light. Her power gone, her empire collapsing around her. Inside, the clubhouse buzzed with a mix of disbelief and exhilaration. Daniel stood silently, feeling the weight of it all sink in. Emily rushed in moments later, having seen the commotion from their house. She threw her arms around him, tears streaming down her face. "It's over," she whispered. "It's really over," but Daniel wasn't smiling. Not yet. Because as the crowd began to disperse, his eyes fell on the stack of documents still sitting on the board's table. Violation records, payment logs, signatures. He picked one up and saw his own name listed under Lien Processing, dated just 2 days ago. Even as Margaret's empire burned, her machine had kept moving. He looked at the crowd, his neighbors, once silent, now emboldened. "This doesn't end tonight," he said. "We rebuild this place improperly this time." They nodded. For the first time, there was unity. Not the kind forced by fear, but the kind born of shared truth. Over the following weeks, the fallout rippled through Clearwater Oaks. Investigators uncovered years of hidden financial manipulation, funds redirected to maintenance projects that never existed, personal reimbursements for community expenses Margaret had pocketed. The HOA's accounts were frozen. Fines were refunded. The lien threats voided. Daniel became a reluctant local hero. Reporters called him the man who took down the HOA. He didn't like the title. It made it sound like this had been about revenge. It wasn't, not really. It had been about dignity, about the right to live without fear of a neighbor's power. The antenna still stood in his backyard, silent and steady, a symbol now, not just of radio, but of resistance. One evening, a few weeks after the arrest, Daniel stood outside at dusk, watching the sunset streak gold and red across the sky. Emily joined him, slipping her hand into his. "You did it," she said softly. He shook his head. "We did, all of us." Across the street, Mrs. Walker waved from her porch. Kids rode bikes again, laughter echoing down the cul-de-sac. For the first time in a long time, Clearwater Oaks looked alive. But even as peace returned, Daniel couldn't forget the feeling of standing in that meeting room, the raw electricity of truth cutting through silence. It reminded him how fragile communities could be when control went unchecked. He took a deep breath, the cool evening air filling his lungs. "You know," he said quietly, "they'll probably form another board eventually. New people. New rules?" Emily smiled. "Maybe, but they'll remember what happened." He nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Good," he said. "They should, because in the end, what destroyed Clearwater Oaks wasn't one antenna or one man's defiance. It was the truth that power built on fear can't last forever." And as the wind rustled through the leaves, carrying faint echoes of laughter and distant thunder, Daniel Brooks knew one thing for certain. The fight had changed him. He'd started as a quiet man, just wanting to live in peace. But when peace demanded silence, he learned how to speak, and when speaking became dangerous, he learned how to stand. Now, finally, he stood without fear. The morning after Margaret Stanton's arrest, Clearwater Oaks felt eerily quiet. The kind of quiet that settles over a place after a long storm. Not peace, not yet. But the stunned silence that comes when people realize everything they thought was permanent has fallen apart. Daniel woke early, stepping out onto the porch with his coffee in hand. For months he had dreaded checking the mailbox, expecting another violation letter or fine notice. Now for the first time the mailbox stood empty. He could almost laugh at how strange that felt, the absence of fear. But the neighborhood wasn't celebrating yet. Beneath the calm, there was a strange unease, like everyone was waiting for the next shoe to drop. Some neighbors avoided eye contact, embarrassed by how long they'd stayed silent. Others, especially those who had suffered their own unfair punishments, were angry, not just at Margaret, but at the system that had enabled her. By mid-morning, a small crowd gathered at the clubhouse. The once imposing building looked smaller now, its windows dark, its flag drooping in the wind. Daniel didn't go inside, not yet. He watched from a distance as volunteers carried out boxes of files, the same ones that had once been used to intimidate them. Later that day, the county issued its official statement. Clearwater Oaks HOA was under state audit for financial misconduct, selective enforcement, and fraudulent collection practices. The accounts were frozen. The board was dissolved. Temporary management would be appointed until residents could vote for a new one. For many, that was justice. But for Daniel, it was only part of the healing. He spent the following weeks rebuilding his routine, fixing the garden, repainting the fence, repairing things he had ignored when every nail, every blade of grass had been under scrutiny. Emily helped, laughing again for the first time in months. Their home, once a battleground, began to feel like a home again. Still, reminders of the past lingered everywhere. Every time he passed the clubhouse, he remembered the shouting, the humiliation, the endless letters. Every time a neighbor waved, he saw the unease behind their smiles, the quiet guilt of people who had watched and done nothing. But slowly, that began to change. One afternoon, as Daniel trimmed the hedge, Mr. Hanley from across the street walked over. He looked uncomfortable at first, hands shoved in his pockets. "Listen," he said, "I should have spoken up sooner. They went after you hard. We all saw it. But I didn't want to get involved." Daniel nodded quietly. "I know. I'm sorry," Hanley said. "We're organizing a petition to dissolve the HOA permanently. We're done with this nonsense. You in?" Daniel hesitated, looking out over the neighborhood, the clean lawns, the quiet driveways, the distant sound of kids playing again. "Yeah," he said finally. "I'm in." Word spread fast. Meetings were held, not in the clubhouse, but in people's yards, under porches, around dinner tables. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years began to connect. They compared stories, shared letters, tallied fines. The picture that emerged was worse than anyone imagined. Margaret hadn't just been power-hungry. She'd been meticulous. She'd altered meeting minutes, funneled HOA fees into fake maintenance projects, and manipulated elections to keep her allies in control. Walter had approved false invoices. Sharon had forged signatures. What they thought was neighborhood order had been a machine built on deceit. The local news ran with the story for weeks. Headlines like HOA president arrested in Clearwater corruption scandal and residents demand end to abusive HOA system dominated social media. People across the state began sharing their own HOA horror stories. It wasn't just a local issue anymore. It was a movement. Daniel found himself unexpectedly at the center of it. Journalists called him for interviews. Legal aid organizations asked him to speak at town halls. He wasn't sure he wanted the attention, but he agreed not for fame, but so no one else would have to live under the same quiet tyranny. One evening he stood before a packed auditorium at a community forum. His voice trembled at first, but grew stronger as he spoke. "You don't realize how much fear can change you," he said. "How it makes you smaller, quieter. You start to think you deserve it. The fines, the warnings, the threats. But the truth is, they only had power because we gave it to them. We let them turn our neighborhood into a cage, and we called it order." The audience sat in silence, hanging on every word. And when one person finally said no, everything they built came crashing down. Not because I was special, but because the truth doesn't need permission to be heard. When the applause came, it was thunderous. Back in Clearwater Oaks, the transformation continued. The temporary state-appointed manager, a calm, no-nonsense woman named Lillian Price, worked with residents to rebuild from the ground up. She organized open meetings, published transparent budgets, and made one simple rule: no decision would ever be made behind closed doors again. Eventually, residents voted to dissolve the HOA completely. The neighborhood would still maintain common areas through a simple collective fund, but there would be no president, no board, no fines. Just cooperation. It wasn't perfect, but it was free. The day the dissolution papers were signed, Daniel stood at the edge of the cul-de-sac and watched the old HOA sign being taken down. The metal post came out of the ground with a squeal, leaving a raw patch of dirt where authority once stood. He felt something loosen inside him, a knot that had been there for far too long. As weeks turned into months, Clearwater Oaks began to thrive in unexpected ways. People repainted their homes in colors they actually liked. Kids chalked the sidewalks without fear of unauthorized markings. Neighbors shared barbecues, helped each other with projects, and laughed without looking over their shoulders. Even the lawns, once manicured into identical perfection, started to look a little wild, and somehow more beautiful for it. One Saturday afternoon, Emily found Daniel sitting on the porch, staring out at the street, lost in thought. "You okay?" she asked, setting down 2 glasses of lemonade. He nodded. "Yeah, just thinking about how much can change when people stop being afraid." She smiled softly. "You should write about it." "You've got something to say now." He looked at her, a small grin tugging at his mouth. "Maybe I already am." In the months that followed, Daniel wrote an op-ed about Clearwater Oaks, about power, community, and what happens when good people stay silent too long. It went viral, shared by people across the country who had their own scars from HOA battles and neighborhood politics. Some called him a whistleblower. Others called him a hero. He didn't feel like either. He just felt free. When spring rolled around, a letter arrived from the state attorney's office. The investigation was complete. Margaret Stanton was convicted of fraud and misuse of community funds, sentenced to serve time and repay restitution. Walter and Sharon took plea deals, agreeing to testify and perform community service. Justice had come. Not swift, but sure. That evening, the residents of Clearwater Oaks gathered for one final community event, a potluck on the green where the HOA meetings used to be held. Tables were covered with homemade food. Children chased fireflies as the sun went down. Someone had even brought a small speaker, playing soft music that drifted through the air like forgiveness. Daniel stood quietly at the edge of it all, watching the laughter, the shared plates, the small kindnesses. Mrs. Walker approached him, carrying a plate of cookies. "You did something big here, Daniel," she said warmly. "You gave us our neighborhood back." He shook his head. "No, we gave it back to ourselves." She smiled, squeezing his arm before walking away. As night fell, Daniel wandered over to the spot where the old HOA sign had stood. The dirt had been replaced with wildflowers, planted by the kids, someone had said. He crouched down, touching the petals gently. In that quiet, he thought about everything that had happened, about how easily control could masquerade as order, how good intentions could rot into obsession, how silence had allowed cruelty to grow unchecked. He also thought about how truth, when finally spoken, could burn through years of fear like sunlight through fog. He stood, looking out over the houses, imperfect, colorful, alive. The air felt different now, open, honest. Later that night, as he and Emily sat together on the porch swing, he asked softly, "Do you think something like that could ever happen again?" She thought for a moment. "Maybe," she said. "But next time, people will remember this. They'll remember that they don't have to be afraid." He nodded, gazing out at the quiet street. The porch light flickered gently, casting long, soft shadows across the grass. "You know," he said, his voice calm but certain, "they say neighborhoods are built on rules. But maybe they're really built on trust." Emily smiled. "And when that breaks?" He looked out into the darkness, eyes steady. "Then you rebuild, stronger than before." A car passed in the distance, headlights sweeping across the houses. The night was peaceful, almost sacred in its stillness. For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt no anger, no bitterness, only a deep, unshakable sense of closure. The fight had cost him sleep, peace, and almost his home. But in the end, it had given him something greater: clarity. He had seen what unchecked power could do, but he had also seen what courage could undo. And as the crickets sang and the air cooled around him, he whispered, half to himself, half to the night, "Maybe the real story isn't about the fight we lost, but the silence we finally broke." A beat of quiet followed, long and deep. Then, softly, he added, "Because sometimes the loudest victory is the one that doesn't need to shout."